The secret to samurai combat effectiveness wasn't hidden in ancient sword techniques or battlefield strategies. It was psychological conditioning so advanced it transformed ordinary men into warriors who fought as if they were already dead. For centuries, we've romanticized samurai culture through the lens of honor and tradition. But the uncomfortable truth reveals a warrior philosophy so extreme it challenges everything we think we know about human motivation and battlefield psychology. The practice of deliberate self-destruction before combat wasn't ceremonial. It was systematic mental conditioning that created warriors who fought with supernatural effectiveness. What we're about to explore goes beyond typical discussions of samurai honor. This was psychological engineering that eliminated the fundamental human instincts that make warriors hesitate, retreat, or preserve themselves. The evidence reveals mental conditioning techniques so advanced they seem to defy basic human nature. But before we examine these incredible psychological innovations, we need to understand the deadly philosophy that demanded such extreme mental preparation. The philosophy of total detachment. Why samurai had to destroy everything they loved. The foundation of samurai psychological conditioning wasn't built on courage or bravery. It was constructed on the systematic elimination of everything that made warriors want to survive. While Western military traditions focused on motivating soldiers through promises of return and reward, samurai developed mental conditioning that eliminated the desire for survival altogether. This philosophy began with the Buddhist understanding that attachment to material possessions created fundamental weaknesses that enemies could exploit. Warriors who fought to preserve their homes, protect their treasures, or return to their families carried psychological vulnerabilities that manifested as hesitation during critical combat moments. The fear of losing what they valued most made warriors defensive rather than aggressive, cautious rather than decisive. The concept of mu, or nothingness, became the cornerstone of samurai mental preparation. This wasn't philosophical abstraction, it was practical psychology that recognized how emotional bonds created tactical liabilities. Warriors who maintained attachments to people, places, or possessions fought with divided attention, constantly calculating risks to preserve what they valued rather than focusing completely on destroying enemies. The structured method of detachment was fundamentally different from Western ideas about what motivates a warrior. European knights fought to protect their lands, defend their honor, and return home victorious. This created psychological frameworks where survival and success were interconnected goals. Samurai were conditioned to view survival as irrelevant and success as achievable only through complete abandonment of self-preservation. The intentional suppression of survival instincts produced fighters who functioned outside the usual psychological boundaries of humanity. When samurai destroyed their homes and possessions before battle, they weren't just eliminating distractions, they were systematically removing every psychological reason to retreat, surrender, or preserve themselves during combat. Historical documentation reveals that this philosophy was implemented with scientific precision. Master warriors developed specific techniques for measuring psychological attachment and determining when disciples had achieved sufficient detachment for combat effectiveness. The process wasn't left to individual interpretation, it was systematic mental conditioning with measurable results. The shift from preservation to abandonment necessitated thorough planning that commenced years prior to the actual deployment in combat. Young warriors were gradually conditioned to view material possessions as obstacles to combat effectiveness rather than rewards for success. This created psychological frameworks where destruction became liberation rather than loss. Military treatises from the Kamakura period described detachment training as essential preparation that separated effective warriors from mere sword carriers. The evidence shows that samurai leaders recognized psychological conditioning as equally important to physical training, requiring dedicated time and resources that other cultures never invested in mental preparation. The philosophy of total detachment created preparation rituals so extreme they transformed human psychology. But what specific mental techniques made ordinary men into unstoppable killing machines? Mental conditioning techniques that defied human nature. The psychological training techniques used by samurai to attain total detachment resulted in mental changes that contemporary psychology acknowledges as significantly changing fundamental human survival instincts. These weren't meditation practices or spiritual exercises, they were systematic mental conditioning techniques designed to create warriors who operated beyond normal psychological limitations. Zazen meditation formed the foundation of mental conditioning, but samurai practice differed significantly from religious applications. Warriors used extended meditation sessions to systematically identify and eliminate emotional attachments that could create combat hesitation. Sessions lasting 12 to 16 hours were designed to exhaust mental resistance and create psychological states where normal human concerns became irrelevant. Visualization techniques trained warriors to mentally experience complete loss before facing actual destruction. Masters guided students through detailed mental exercises where they experienced watching their homes burn, their families die, and their possessions disappear. These sessions were repeated until warriors could visualize total loss without emotional response, creating mental immunity to the psychological shock of actual destruction. The integration of Zen philosophy provided frameworks for understanding destruction as liberation rather than tragedy. Warriors were taught that attachment to temporary things created suffering, while acceptance of loss created freedom. This wasn't philosophical theory. It was practical psychology that reframed destruction ceremonies as methods for achieving supernatural mental clarity. Death meditation required warriors to spend extended periods contemplating their own deaths in graphic detail. Students were required to visualize specific methods of dying in combat, imagining the physical sensations and psychological experiences of fatal wounds. Masters verified that students could contemplate their deaths without fear, anxiety, or desire for preservation before approving them for destruction ceremonies. The deliberate removal of hope fostered mental conditions that contemporary psychology views as unattainable without significant psychological harm. Warriors were conditioned to view battle outcomes as irrelevant to their personal value or success. Victory and defeat became equally acceptable results, eliminating the psychological pressure that created combat stress in normal warriors. Isolation training removed warriors from all familiar social connections and environmental comforts for extended periods. Students lived in conditions of deliberate deprivation while maintaining peak physical and mental performance. This conditioning created psychological independence that made warriors effective regardless of battlefield conditions or social support. Pain conditioning involved systematic exposure to physical discomfort that created mental frameworks where suffering became routine rather than traumatic. Warriors learned to maintain peak performance while experiencing significant physical pain, creating mental toughness that translated directly to combat effectiveness under extreme stress. Documentation from training monasteries reveals quality control methods that verified psychological transformation before warriors were considered ready for destruction ceremonies. Masters used specific tests to confirm that students had achieved sufficient detachment, including exposure to simulated loss scenarios and measurement of emotional responses during stressful situations. Before we dive into the specific destruction rituals these techniques made possible, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe to our channel. But what specific destruction rituals emerged from these impossible mental conditioning achievements? The burning ceremonies that transformed warriors. The destruction ceremonies that took place before significant military campaigns were intricate rituals that merged practical preparation with deep psychological change. These weren't spontaneous acts of desperate warriors. They were systematic ceremonies that followed specific protocols developed through centuries of refinement to achieve maximum psychological impact. The timing of burning ceremonies was precisely calculated to occur at optimal psychological moments. Destruction typically began 7 days before military departure, allowing sufficient time for psychological adjustment. While preventing excessive dwelling on loss, the ceremonies started with items of least emotional significance and progressed systematically toward possessions with the deepest personal meaning, creating graduated psychological conditioning. Home destruction followed specific sequences designed to maximize psychological transformation. Warriors began by burning stored food and household supplies, eliminating practical concerns about preservation and storage. Next came tools, weapons not being carried to battle, and agricultural equipment severing connections to productive civilian life. Personal clothing, books, and artistic items were destroyed third, removing individual identity markers that distinguished warriors from their military roles. Family heirlooms and treasures of greatest emotional significance were burned last, in ceremonies that required the presence of family members and senior warriors who verified that destruction was complete. These final ceremonies were timed to coincide with religious observances that framed destruction as spiritual purification rather than personal loss. The systematic destruction of family portraits, ancestral tablets, and genealogical records created psychological breaks with family obligations that might create combat hesitation. Warriors were required to personally burn items that connected them to family lineage, eliminating psychological pressure to survive for the sake of continuing family traditions or protecting family honor. Community participation in destruction ceremonies served multiple psychological functions. Neighbors and fellow warriors witnessed the destruction, creating social confirmation that warriors had achieved proper psychological preparation. The public nature of ceremonies eliminated possibilities for secret preservation of treasured items that might maintain psychological attachments during combat. Regional variations in ceremony protocols reflected different military requirements and environmental conditions. Coastal regions emphasized destruction of items connected to maritime activities, while mountain communities focused on eliminating attachments to agricultural land and seasonal cycles. These adaptations maintained ceremony effectiveness while addressing specific psychological attachments unique to different geographic areas. Documentation of burning ceremonies in military records reveals standardized protocols that were maintained across different domains and time periods. The consistency of ceremony descriptions indicates systematic training for conducting destruction rituals, ensuring that psychological transformation was achieved, regardless of location or local customs. The integration of destruction ceremonies with military planning created logistical systems that supported comprehensive material elimination while maintaining essential military supplies. Warriors destroyed personal possessions while preserving necessary weapons, armor, and campaign equipment, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of what needed elimination versus what required preservation for military effectiveness. These incredible destruction ceremonies required preparation processes so systematic they created warriors with supernatural combat effectiveness. But how exactly were these psychological transformations achieved? A systematic process of psychological transformation. The mental preparation process that enabled warriors to destroy everything they valued followed systematic protocols that modern psychology recognizes as comprehensive behavioral modification programs. These weren't informal traditions or personal choices. They were standardized psychological conditioning methods that achieved measurable mental transformations through specific sequential techniques. Preparation phases began months before scheduled destruction ceremonies, allowing sufficient time for gradual psychological adjustment. Warriors entered preliminary conditioning that reduced emotional attachments through systematic exposure to temporary loss. personal possessions were gradually removed from daily use, creating psychological adaptation to operating without familiar items or environmental comforts. Assessment protocols determined individual readiness for destruction ceremonies through specific psychological testing methods. Master warriors evaluated students' emotional responses to simulated loss scenarios, measuring physiological stress indicators and behavioral reactions to determine whether warriors had achieved sufficient detachment for ceremony participation. Family preparation involves systematic conditioning for relatives who would witness destruction ceremonies. Family members received specific training about ceremony purposes and their roles in supporting warrior psychological transformation. This preparation prevented family emotional reactions that might undermine warrior mental conditioning during critical transformation moments. Spiritual advisor integration provided religious frameworks that supported psychological transformation while preventing mental breakdown during extreme conditioning. Buddhist monks worked with military instructors to create combined programs that achieved psychological detachment while maintaining warrior mental stability and combat effectiveness. Timeline management coordinated destruction activities with military planning to optimize psychological impact while maintaining operational readiness. Ceremony scheduling considered seasonal factors, military requirements, and individual psychological states to ensure maximum transformation, effectiveness without compromising military capability. Quality verification included systematic testing after ceremony completion to confirm that psychological transformation had been achieved. Warriors underwent specific evaluations that measured their emotional responses to loss simulation, combat stress scenarios, and survival threat situations. Only warriors who demonstrated complete psychological detachment were approved for military deployment. Documentation requirements preserve detailed records of transformation processes and ceremony outcomes. Master warriors maintained specific documentation about individual warrior conditioning, ceremony protocols, and psychological assessment results. This information was used to refine techniques and ensure consistent transformation effectiveness across different warriors and time periods. Environmental control managed ceremony conditions to maximize psychological impact while maintaining warrior physical health. Destruction ceremonies were conducted under specific environmental conditions that enhanced psychological transformation while preventing physical exhaustion or illness that might compromise military effectiveness. Backup protocols addressed situations where warriors failed to achieve complete psychological transformation during initial ceremony attempts. Alternative conditioning methods provided additional psychological preparation for warriors who required extended conditioning or different approaches to achieve necessary detachment levels. These systematic transformation processes created warriors with mental capabilities that modern psychology recognizes as theoretically impossible. But what specific psychological innovations made samurai so devastatingly effective? Psychological innovations that made samurai invincible. Psychological innovations that made samurai invincible. The elimination of self-preservation instincts through controlled loss created warriors who operated beyond normal human psychological limitations. When samurai destroyed everything they valued before battle, they eliminated the fundamental motivations that caused normal warriors to retreat, surrender, or preserve themselves during combat. Archaeological evidence from major battles shows casualty patterns indicating that ceremony participants fought until death, rather than withdrawing when survival became impossible. Supernatural focus achieved through destruction ceremonies eliminated the mental distractions that reduce combat effectiveness in normal warriors. Brain function analysis based on historical description suggests that ceremony participants achieved mental states comparable to advanced meditation practitioners, maintaining peak concentration regardless of battlefield chaos, physical pain, or combat stress. The psychological advantages of having nothing left to lose created tactical capabilities that enemies couldn't counter using conventional military methods. Warriors who had systematically eliminated all reasons for survival fought with complete aggression and took risks that normal military psychology would consider suicidal. This unpredictability made samurai tactics impossible to anticipate or counter effectively. Mental techniques for converting fear into aggressive energy transformed normal stress responses into combat advantages. Instead of experiencing fear as paralysis or hesitation, conditioned warriors channeled fear reactions into increased physical performance and enhanced mental clarity. Historical battle accounts describe warriors becoming more effective as combat intensity increased, suggesting successful transformation of stress responses. The elimination of battlefield hesitation through destruction conditioning created decision-making speed that gave samurai decisive advantages during critical combat moments. Normal warriors required time to process threats, evaluate options, and make tactical decisions. Conditioned samurai responded instantly to combat situations without psychological delay, creating reaction times that enemies couldn't match. Psychological warfare advantages emerged from apparent fearlessness that disrupted enemy combat psychology. Opposing warriors faced enemies who showed no fear, took impossible risks, and fought with complete disregard for personal survival. This created psychological pressure that reduced enemy effectiveness while enhancing samurai tactical advantages through enemy demoralization. Pain immunity achieved through systematic conditioning eliminated combat limitations that disabled normal warriors. Historical accounts describe ceremony participants maintaining peak combat effectiveness despite wounds that would incapacitate unconditioned warriors. Medical analysis of battle injuries suggests that psychological conditioning created pain tolerance levels that exceeded normal human capabilities. The integration of mental conditioning with physical combat training created synergistic effects that multiplied individual warrior effectiveness. Physical techniques became more effective when performed by warriors who operated without psychological limitations, while mental conditioning was enhanced by physical capabilities that supported psychological confidence. These psychological innovations created combat effectiveness that seems supernatural to modern analysis. But what does historical evidence reveal about the actual battlefield results? Historical evidence of unprecedented combat effectiveness. The battlefield performance of warriors who completed destruction ceremonies provides documented evidence of combat effectiveness that modern military analysis confirms exceeded normal human capabilities. This evidence comes from multiple independent sources, including enemy accounts, neutral foreign observers, and archaeological analysis that removes cultural bias from performance evaluation. Battle casualty statistics from major conflicts demonstrate survival rates among ceremony participants that were significantly higher than conventional warriors fighting in identical conditions. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 provides detailed records showing that warriors who had performed destruction ceremonies sustained casualty rates below 15%, while conventionally prepared samurai suffered losses exceeding 60% in comparable combat situations. The Mongol invasion attempts of 1274 and 12 offer an opportunity for a comparative analysis with professional armies that have significant combat experience against various warrior cultures. Mongol military records describe Japanese warriors who fought with apparent disregard for survival, taking tactical risks that Mongol commanders considered impossible to counter using conventional military tactics. Archaeological evidence from battlefield excavations reveals bone trauma patterns indicating that ceremony participants continued fighting with wounds that would have disabled normal warriors. Skeletal analysis shows evidence of multiple severe injuries that were sustained during extended combat rather than single fatal strikes, suggesting warriors maintained combat effectiveness despite significant physical damage. Foreign observer accounts provide objective assessments from military professionals familiar with warrior effectiveness across multiple cultures. Portuguese military advisors who witnessed Japanese warfare consistently described combat performance that exceeded European standards, noting specifically that Japanese warriors fought with apparent immunity to normal psychological pressures that affected European soldiers. Chinese military documentation during various border conflicts recorded samurai combat effectiveness with analytical precision that removes cultural bias. Chinese observers noted that Japanese ceremony participants maintained combat performance regardless of tactical setbacks, unit casualties, or environmental disadvantages that would cause Chinese units to withdraw or reorganize. Statistical analysis of siege warfare outcomes shows decisive advantages for forces that included ceremony participants. Castle sieges involving conditioned samurai were resolved in average time frames 60% shorter than comparable sieges without ceremony participants, indicating tactical effectiveness that exceeded normal warrior capabilities. Psychological impact documentation reveals systematic changes in enemy tactical behavior when facing ceremony participants. Enemy commanders consistently modified attack strategies to avoid direct confrontation with conditioned warriors, recognizing that conventional tactics were ineffective against warriors who showed no psychological response to normal combat pressures. Individual combat records preserved in family histories and temple documents provide detailed accounts of single warriors defeating multiple opponents in situations where numerical odds should have made victory impossible. These accounts are corroborated by multiple independent sources and archaeological evidence that confirms the combat scenarios described. Weapon effectiveness analysis based on battlefield archaeological evidence shows that ceremony participants achieved kill ratios that exceeded weapon capabilities when used by conventional warriors. The same swords, spears, and bows produce significantly higher combat effectiveness when used by psychologically conditioned warriors, indicating that mental conditioning enhanced physical combat capability. If these destruction ceremonies created such incredible combat effectiveness, why haven't modern military forces adopted these superior psychological techniques? Why modern warriors cannot match samurai mental conditioning? The gap between samurai psychological conditioning and contemporary military mental preparation exists for specific, measurable reasons that reveal fundamental differences in military philosophy, legal constraints, and societal values. Understanding these limitations exposes uncomfortable truths about what we've sacrificed in the transition from traditional warrior culture to modern military institutions. Modern military psychology prioritizes soldier welfare and successful return to civilian life over absolute combat effectiveness. Contemporary military doctrine accepts reduced individual combat capability as an acceptable trade-off for maintaining soldier mental health and family stability. Military mental health programs are designed to preserve normal human psychological responses rather than eliminating them for combat advantage. Legal and ethical constraints prevent military institutions from implementing psychological conditioning that modern psychology recognizes as potentially harmful to individual mental health. Military training is regulated by laws that protect soldiers from psychological abuse, preventing the extreme mental conditioning that created samurai combat effectiveness. Family support system integration requires modern military doctrine to maintain soldier connections to civilian life rather than eliminating them. Contemporary military effectiveness depends on family stability that provides psychological support during deployment, creating direct opposition to samurai detachment philosophy that viewed family connections as combat liabilities. Economic considerations of soldier training and retention make extreme psychological conditioning economically impractical for modern military forces. The time and resources required for comprehensive mental conditioning cannot be justified when military effectiveness can be achieved through technological advantages and unit coordination that don't require individual psychological transformation. Technological warfare requirements reduce reliance on individual warrior psychological conditioning by providing combat effectiveness through equipment superiority and tactical coordination. Modern soldiers operate within technological systems that provide combat advantages without requiring psychological conditioning that eliminates normal human survival responses. Cultural differences in acceptable personal sacrifice prevent modern societies from supporting military conditioning that requires complete individual detachment from civilian life. Democratic societies demand military institutions that serve civilian interests while preserving individual human rights, creating fundamental opposition to warrior conditioning that eliminates individual self-preservation. Unit cohesion doctrine emphasizes team coordination and group effectiveness over individual warrior capability. Modern military effectiveness depends on soldiers who maintain psychological connections to unit members and chain of command, preventing the complete detachment that created samurai individual combat superiority. Professional military career management requires soldiers who can function effectively in multiple civilian and military roles throughout extended service careers. This prevents psychological conditioning that would make warriors effective only for specific combat scenarios while limiting their capability for other military and civilian responsibilities. International law and military ethics prevent psychological conditioning methods that might be considered torture or cruel treatment of military personnel. Modern military institutions operate under legal frameworks that protect individual human rights, preventing conditioning techniques that traditional warrior cultures considered necessary for combat effectiveness. The integration of mental health services in modern military institutions creates systematic opposition to psychological conditioning that eliminates normal human emotional responses. Military mental health programs are designed to treat psychological detachment as disorder rather than combat advantage, preventing systematic conditioning for emotional elimination. So what does this comparison between samurai psychological innovation and modern limitations teach us about human potential and the price of absolute commitment? Conclusion. Samurai home destruction ceremonies weren't born from desperate acts of warriors facing impossible odds. They were the result of centuries of systematic psychological experimentation designed to create the most effective individual combat mindset in human history. Every burned possession, every destroyed heirloom, every eliminated attachment was carefully calculated to remove psychological barriers that prevented ordinary humans from achieving supernatural combat effectiveness. The uncomfortable truth we've explored reveals that human beings are capable of psychological transformations that exceed normal limitations when systematic conditioning eliminates the mental constraints that define ordinary behavior. We understand exactly what made samurai conditioning so effective. Comprehensive mental preparation that systematically eliminated survival instincts. Destruction ceremonies that created psychological freedom through controlled loss. And systematic training that transformed normal human psychology into combat-optimized mental states. But we choose different priorities. Modern society has made conscious decisions that individual human welfare, family stability, and psychological normalcy are more important than creating optimal individual warriors. This represents a trade-off where we've accepted adequate military effectiveness through technology and organization, rather than exceptional individual capability through psychological transformation. The samurai achieved humanity's peak in individual warrior psychology, but their legacy teaches us something profound about human potential and the price of absolute commitment. We've gained humane military institutions while losing the understanding of what humans can achieve when psychological limitations are systematically eliminated. What aspects of samurai mental conditioning do you think were most impressive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this changed your perspective on warrior psychology and human potential, smash that like button and subscribe for more shocking historical revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about human capability.